All right. Well, I extend warm greetings to the APU community, all of our administrators, faculty, staff, even board members that may be joining us. Thank you for joining us for this important conversation that's co-sponsored by the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Division, as well as APU's Asian Mosaic Association. The title of the panel discussion is Lift Our Voices, APU Asian Women Speak. And so we hope all of you are safe and well. We're encouraged to know that COVID cases and deaths in the US are declining. However, we do find it alarming and disheartening that anti-Asian sentiment, violence, and xenophobia is actually on the rise in the US. Some of you may know this. Over the past year, the reports of anti-Asian sentiment has increased by 150%, according to reports tracked by Stop AAPI Hate. There has been well over 3,800 reported anti-Asian racist incidents that have taken place in the US. And it is concerning that that number may be low as there's so many incidents that are unreported. And a lot of these incidents have been targeted and directed towards many of our Asian sisters and neighbors. And so obviously we find these statistics to be staggering, but it definitely gives us reason to come together as a community, to think critically, to learn how these recent events are affecting not just the national climate, but the APU community, specifically our Asian American community, our AAPI community, for the purpose of deepening our empathic capacity to gather insights on ways we can move forward and better support our Asian American community members. We're also hoping that this will be a time that we can further consider ways we can lean into our faith to build a Christ-centered culture of love, inclusion, and solidarity. And so again, we thank all of you for taking time to be a part of this experience. We would like to thank many of you who posed questions through the RSVP process. Please know that those questions have been gathered. The panel will do their best to address each of the theme questions as best they can with the time that we have. We also want to make you aware that the chat function is active. And so if you would like to pose additional questions, or maybe even an affirming thought based on what's shared by our esteemed panel of Christian Asian women at APU, we encourage you to do that. We will collect all of those questions, even if they're not answered in this one setting. We would like to collect those questions and consider how we can address them and in the future. So please do not be bashful about posing questions or even sharing thoughts that resonate with you as you listen to the panelists. We would also like to let you know that we are recording this event. We know that some of our colleagues and students, they couldn't make it. And so we want to make sure that we can share this resource with them. We also, once we make this recording public, we want to strongly encourage you to share it within those who are within your sphere of influence. And so we thank you for being ambassadors and supportive of DEI work. Lastly, just some slight acknowledgements that we want to highlight. Listen, we have very well decorated faculty and staff who have agreed to be on this panel. They have been very gracious and willing to process together and allow us to learn and to glean from their observations, the impact that recent anti-Asian incidents have had on them, the way that it's even intersecting with their faith. And so we really encourage you to offer your deepest attention and support to them, your prayerful consideration. This is not easy. They're putting themselves in a very vulnerable space to have this conversation. And so we just want to thank our panelists, and you will be exposed to their introductions in just a few moments. Secondly, even though the women who are serving on this panel, they have a shared cultural experience, it is important to acknowledge the diversity within diversity. And so all of them have different lived experiences. You'll hear about that at the beginning of the conversation. And some of what they share is their unique perspective. And sometimes it may not be generalizable to all women who identify as Asian American or Pacific Islander. So that's something to kind of bear in mind as you also listen in and hear some of the reflections from our panelists. Most importantly, I think is critical for us to express just a incredible appreciation for our panelists, but so many of our Asian colleagues at APU who bring incredible intellectual capacity, cultural heritage, um, uh, deep and broad faith that enriches our community. And so it's important for us to acknowledge that. It's important for us to stand in solidarity with our colleagues, especially during this time where so much hurt and pain is evident. And so your presence today communicates that degree of support, but we also want to share some actionable items for your consideration, and you'll hear that directly from our panelists today. So again, on behalf of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Division and our Asian Mosaic Association, thank you so much for joining us. At this time, let's pray together, and then I'll give way to Dr. Ron Ju, who serves as Associate Dean of the School of Business and Management. And Dr. Ju also serves as the president of the Asian Mosaic Association. Pray with me. God, thank you for this day, and thank you for your blessings. And God, we're so grateful for our diverse community. We know that diversity, equity, and inclusion are not just attractive words, Father, they are kingdom distinctives. And we're so grateful for our panelists, our colleagues who will liberally share their thoughts and share their faith and some of their observations. God, I pray that their shared thoughts will resonate in our hearts, deepen our empathic capacity and our Christ-centered approach in demonstrating solidarity and love to the diverse demography of faculty, staff, and students that are part of our community. And so we give you glory for what will transpire. In Jesus' name we do pray. Amen. Dr. Ju.
Thank you, Dr. Hall, for your leadership to make this event happen. And it's good to be with all of you today. On behalf of the Asian Mosaic Association, I would like to welcome you to this special event. As a result of the rise of anti-Asian sentiment and hate crimes during this pandemic, along with the tragic mass shooting in Atlanta last month, where 8 people lost their lives, 6 of them Asian American women, fear among members of the Asian American Pacific Islander community has reached crisis levels. This crisis has impacted faculty, staff, and students in our own APU community, and a conversation of concern, which began at our last AMA meeting, has led to this panel of 4 remarkable Asian American women to share their stories and perspective. As president of AMA, it is my honor to briefly introduce to you the 4 voices, and please refer to the chat for more complete bio for each speaker. But today, please welcome Courtney Davis, Program Director and Associate Professor Communication Management, Regina Trammell, Associate Professor, Department of Social Work, Kirsten O, Professor, Department of Practical Theology, and Jennifer Elrod, Program Manager, Master of Nursing Healthcare Administration Program. We are so excited to hear from each of you, and so this time is now yours.
Thanks, Ron. Really appreciate you. And Keith, thanks so much for having all of us. As both Keith and Ron mentioned, our conversation today is really the result of and part of our process of becoming. And so, as you've heard, this originated in the Asian Mosaic Association meeting. And certainly there are a number of other Asian American women who could be here. And so we invite you to connect with them as well. We have enjoyed, the four of us, an opportunity over the last 4 to 5 weeks being able to process together and engage what this kind of conversation in a more public space could look like. And so we have talked about all of these things in addition to how to raise mixed race children, how to lead in professional spaces, and of course, maybe one of our most favorite topics, where to find the best Korean hot dogs and mochi donuts. So it's with that spirit that we invite all of you to recognize and hear that we are embracing some tensions as we enter this conversation. That on the one hand, this is a remarkably intimate space for the four of us, one that has been a remarkably hospitable space for us, as intimate and hospitable as Zoom can be, as we have processed the last 4 to 5 weeks. On the other hand, there are many insights that many of us would love for you as members of our community, for you to hear, to learn, to understand, and to take with you. And so I hopefully help you understand that this is both an intimate conversation where you get to hear what it is that the four of us have been processing, and also we do have a heart to share some things for you to hear. So as we enter that space, Keith mentioned a great spirit of hospitality among the four of us, that we are indeed coming from different places, that we have indeed invited great difference, and even as we share those identities as Asian American women. And so we hope you see our diversity of thought. We hope you see our diversity of experience and get to step into a space that is not a monolithic depiction of a really thin slice of Asian American Christian women. So we hope that this is the start of many conversations, not just among the four of us, but certainly other Asian American men and women in our community that are both in your immediate and perhaps not so immediate circles. So let's get started. One of the questions that we started with really early on, the four of us, was how are you entering this conversation today? So let me invite Jennifer. How are you entering this conversation today?
Good morning, Courtney. Thank you so much. And good morning, everyone. I am entering this conversation today as a first-generation mixed Asian American, born and raised in the San Gabriel Valley. My dad is white and my mom is Filipino and Chinese. And so for me, I'm entering this conversation growing up in the small western town of San Dimas, where I absolutely assimilated to the dominant white culture. And so being mixed, checking all that apply on those boxes was not something that existed until the year 2000 with the census. And so it has been my own journey after college at APU. I am class of 08 and 09, that I really was able to unpack my own Asian heritage. It's been attending a multi-ethnic church in a multi-ethnic space where we have studied and unpacked what it means to be Asian, including an Asian American civil rights tour, and just doing my own unpacking of racial reconciliation. And so that is how I am entering the conversation today. Regina, what about you? How are you entering today's conversation?
Good morning, Courtney. Good morning, Jennifer, and everyone too. Thank you for that question. So I'm a second generation Chinese American born and raised in Los Angeles, specifically in Eagle Rock, which was a very diverse community growing up. I have extended family in the area. And what's also important to know is that I lived in Chicago for about 10 years, which was outside of this LA bubble. And it opened my eyes a bit more to the Asian American experience outside of this area that we call home. So it is in this space I enter it shaped by this LA-based view of diversity mix of Latino, Asian, Northeast, Los Angeles, unified, raised, and a true daughter of this city. So when people ask me where I'm from, I get very specific. The more they demand to speak to my looks rather than the truth, I tell them again that I'm from LA and let them ponder that a bit more to mess with their notions of who is American and who gets to tell the American story. What about you, Kirsten? How do you enter this space?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's so good to be here with you. You know, I entered this space as a Korean American who immigrated to the US as a 9-year-old. I enter the conversation today as someone who grew up mostly in the Southern California, Los Angeles area. And growing up, I have always been in search for the reign of God. But I have to say, especially during this time of double pandemics of COVID-19 and racism, I entered this conversation as a daughter of a Korean American elderly couple, a sister to a female clergy, an aunt to 2 teenage Korean American high schoolers, and a mom to a mixed race daughter. I entered this conversation with the generative hope that our conversation here today with our APU community, and that the conversations like these in our various communities of faith have the power to transform the hearts and minds and behaviors of listeners who will together curb personal, institutional, and systemic racism in the US for the next generation of people of color, including Asian Americans. How about you, Courtney?
Well, it's complicated, depending on how you divide it. I'm a 3rd or 4th generation Chinese American. I was raised to thrive in majority culture settings, and along the way, I learned that achievement was really my ticket to love and acceptance. I remember the days of forwarded emails on AOL and receiving one called 100 Ways to Know That You're Asian, and strangely, only being able to check off about 22 of them. I think in my early career days in politics and government spaces, I learned that I felt far more uncomfortable in rooms of Asian and Asian American people than I did in white spaces or in a mixed multitude. But perhaps most descriptively, for the purpose of this conversation, I think I'm entering in the midst of an enduring battle of imposter syndrome related specifically to how I engage my Asian American identity. Not entirely sure I belong here, and I know we've had that conversation, and sometimes feeling grossly unqualified to speak about my Asian American heritage. I'm also here to learn and to listen, and especially as my husband and I are raising 2 young boys who are half Chinese, a quarter Armenian, and a quarter Texan. So let's get going. Regina, the first question is for you. You'll kick us off. So that first question is, how has the most recent rise in anti-Asian violence, including the Atlanta shootings, how has that impacted you and those you love?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Courtney. It's a good one. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this question, so I just wanted to share maybe more of my feelings and some of the immediate reactions. So when news of the Atlanta shooting happened, I felt immediately very vulnerable in a way that I had never been before growing up here in LA area. I read these women's names, I read their ages, I saw these victims' pictures. One of them was a mother of 2 teen boys close to my kids' ages. And I kept thinking it could have been me pretty easily. What was also disappointing was just the quick turnaround, this quick victim blaming because of their status as massage workers, and the centering of the police officer who explained away these murders so nonchalantly. That made me really angry. Not only that, my pastor posted on Facebook expressions of compassion after the Atlanta shootings, and commenters also explained away these lives lost so easily. People, Christians who have no idea, have tried to explain similar things to me, how my race and ethnicity doesn't matter. And so I cried after those shootings. I couldn't concentrate. I processed my feelings with friends, took some time, wrote down a few thoughts down about my identity. And I just wanted our community to know that what was really impactful for me was that the first people who texted me to check in on me after the Atlanta shootings were my Black Christian female friends. They got what I was going through right away because they have endured the same feelings, if not more so, for so much longer than I have. And my Black sisters remind me that the only way we can work toward justice is to shed a light on the sinfulness that is racism, how toxic it is for society, and how toxic it is for an individual to hold on to racist thoughts, judgments, and acts. Black and Asian solidarity in America is a balm to the weariness that sets in for me at times. On a more personal note, I'm much more fearful of my parents, my 91-year-old grandmother, my 90-some-year-old aunt. We live long lives, you guys. And I'm just really actually fearful for their well-being for the first time in my life. You have all likely seen these videos, elderly pushed without warning, a Thai man died. There are countless others too. Recently, just this week in New York City, a man's head was stomped on. He's in a medically induced coma right now as we speak. He was just walking around, picking up cans to help feed his family. And specifically, my dad has walked around Eagle Rock all my life, every day just about. Now he has to carry a stick with him. He used to do so rarely because of potential meetings with coyotes. Now he walks with his walking stick every day because of potential run-ins with people who wish him harm. We conversed about which streets he walked and how he felt. My grandmother at 91 used to walk to the bus and take it to Chinatown once a week, or my mother would drive her. They would pick up Chinese newspapers, get some veggies, maybe eat a quick lunch. They have avoided the area. And my mother explained to me a couple of weeks ago, it's just not safe. She doesn't want to go there anymore. So really, Courtney, I just lament the life that these elders in my family used to live, the quality of life that they used to enjoy for over 50 years. It always strikes me that my parents have been here in the US for over 53 years now. They have saluted the flag, paid their taxes, and voted for over 53 years. Who is more American, then I ask, the perpetrators of these inhumane acts or my parents? I certainly know the answer. I hope you all do too. And with that, let me ask Jennifer the same question.
Thank you, Regina. I'm teary just hearing you share some of those reflections, because I think I've sat in the same level of emotions of Kirsten had mentioned earlier. We have two pandemics, the pandemic that we're in with COVID-19 and then the pandemic of racism. And so I would say Atlanta, the news of Atlanta hit myself and my BIPOC communities different. It hit it so much different because I think we've been living in this existence of knowing that there's been 3,900 reported incidents of Asian hate from February of last year to March of this year. And that's what's been reported. And so hearing the news of Atlanta, you know, I feel like mass shootings are common ground that we hear about in the news. But then to hear that they were Asian spas, and then to hear that they were specifically Korean women, I think my heart dropped into the pit of my stomach. I found myself in tears. I found myself lamenting, writing a prayer of lament, crying out to God, you know, oh Lord, how long? And then those few days to follow, I'm pretty sure I spent 36 hours in my PJs, which is at least half the work uniform right now in pandemic, where it's business on top, PJs on the bottom. But truly spent 36 hours in PJs, just everything I would see posted or checking in on BIPOC friends. Just I found myself so teary, unable to control the emotions and just having this deep sense of grief and this deep sense of sorrow. But like Regina mentioned, like it was my friends of color, it was my Asian friends who showed up first. And so there's something really beautiful in how we collectively care for each other and how we show up for one another. And there, in the Korean culture, there's this term called Han, where it's this collective sorrow, grief, lament of injustice. And I don't think English words properly describe what it is, but I feel like that's what the sense that I have felt with my Asian friends, specifically with my sisters of Korean culture, is just this deep sorrow, sense of grief. And so I'm very thankful for my BIPOC communities that did show up through food, through text messages, Starbucks, and just presence. But then I also sit in this place of I've had to have some really difficult conversations in white spaces and with white friends. I think I had one white colleague here at the university reach out to me a couple days later. And it was only my promptings of how I was doing or that I was struggling through the emotions of just sitting in them or just functioning to work. And so it's definitely been a difficult process to process through Atlanta and to sit in these emotions, but also very thankful for this sisterhood that we have had in navigating these spaces together. And I'm sure we will share some of our food recommendations at the end. But I think, again, Asian culture, there's so much comfort in food and comfort in this connection that we have found together. But Courtney, I'd love to pose the same question to you. How are you doing since Atlanta? How have you been processing with the uprise in Asian violence and just processing through all that we're discussing?
Yeah, I appreciate the word processing because it has indeed been processing. And I think I would say that it's best exemplified through a story that I'll tell. It was a couple weeks after the Atlanta shootings, and I had thankfully just dropped my kids off at school. Praise the Lord for that. And I had been driving on Gladstone. Those of you who are local to the APU area, you'll know this, but I was driving east on Gladstone, and I went to turn left onto Sunflower to get onto the 210 freeway going east. I was going to get my second vaccine shot. And it was literally, I was in the left-hand turn lane, ready to turn onto Sunflower to get onto the freeway. And I had a work truck that was behind me. And as I turned left, I drove the one city block, a big city block, to get onto the freeway. And this work truck behind me tailed me the whole way. And as I turned right to get onto the 210 East, the work truck zoomed past me and flipped me off in the back window, waving his middle finger. And it was not just a quick flip the bird out the window. It was really like a good significant 5 to 6 seconds. And I'll just have you know, my driving does not usually warrant people flipping me off. I don't get flipped off very often. I want to be clear about that. But it was one of the first times, I think, because of the recent rise in anti-Asian violence, the Atlanta shootings, and I feel myself actually getting emotional talking about it. One of the first times that I had asked the question of myself, what could have been so offensive about my driving in a city block that would have warranted that response? And a very dear friend who's one of our participants today remembers the phone call. She happened to call me. I'm on the 210 and she asked me, hey, how are you doing? I said, the weirdest thing just happened. But I recognize, I think the take home message here for me, what has been most impactful, apart from my emotion, is that I am asking questions that I never asked before. That maybe it's because of the way that I am perceived, the way that I am seen, my Asian American identity, that actually is offensive to others. And that has been, my interest is not to name hate crimes. My interest is not to name or speculate what the other gentleman was understanding or perceiving. He could have been in a hurry. He could have been in all these things. I think for the first time I asked, is it actually because of what I look like? And that has been a deeply difficult question to ask, one that I think I've not wanted to ask for a number of years, but one that I think I need to start asking, because when I think about the violence, when I think about my parents, nobody asks them to what extent you identify with the Asian American community. Nobody asks you the extent to which you are embedded in your cultural heritage. It really is what you look like. And I think it has raised some questions for me about who am I becoming? What do people expect from me? And how do I hold fast to the gospel in the midst of great brokenness in my very midst? Okay, I'm going to try to get myself together. Kirsten, your turn.
Thank you so much. I just so appreciate my sisters here who shared so personally at a very emotional level, because this was an emotional processes for all of us here. Although we have had different stories of our own Asian American identities, this whole Atlanta massacre for me was an inflection point. There are two inflection points that really happened for me the last year. The first one was the killing of George Floyd, and then this Atlanta massacre. For me, the hypersexualization of Asian American women, it's not new. We saw this in the Page Exclusion Act of 1875 that prohibited the entry of Chinese women due to colonized stereotype against. This already placed in the American ethos that the eradication of Asian women is an excusable crime, especially if sexual addiction was claimed. Though not new, it still shook me and rocked my identity as an American female of Korean descent. The massacre has affected both my sense of personal and collective racial trauma. The generation trauma we carry in our bodies via epigenetic means as a perpetual foreigner. It highlights our silence, partly from the fear of retaliation for speaking out, where Asian American process without visibility due to cultural and societal pressures, like the internalized racial inferiority, colorism, and the myth of white supremacy. The silence that often makes us invisible is also the result of the myth of model minority. The myth that Asians are smart, polite, successful, law-abiding, hardworking, socioeconomically thriving model citizens, and are shining examples of overcoming racism and discrimination to live the American dream. This description given by Joss Lama says that the problem is that these stereotypes create a monolithic narrative that leaves no room for the full range of diasporic and diverse experiences. It erases the diversity of 24 Asian countries and even more ethnic groups that comprise Asian America, and that the huge disparity between these Asian groups, such as the successful Asian American narrative, causes us to be a monolithic group. In fact, Asian Americans are some of the richest and the poorest, with the greatest economic disparities among any minority group in the US. And as trauma does, the Atlanta massacre triggered memories of racism I faced growing up in Glendale, California, where I was told to go home, chink, countless times. And then as a freshman pre-med student at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, where I was stereotypically fetishized as a China doll. At the same time, elicited the memories of Asian American female trailblazers in history, such as Yuri Kochiyama, a revolutionary civil rights activist who, through forced incarceration as girl of Japanese descent during World War II, helped define American activism by her advocacy for inner city children in Harlem. Patsy Mink was the first woman of color in Congress in 1964. Matsuye Hirono, the first elected female senator from Hawaii, the first Asian American woman elected to the Senate in 2013. Grace Lee Boggs, American academic and author and social activist who brought together diverse communities to rebuild Detroit in the 1970s and became a key figure in the Asian American movement with 5 influential books. These are a part of the gifts that Asian Americans possess. The sense of Chang, a Korean word that talks about the interconnectedness and interdependence of all people, that we all have to stand in solidarity against the injustice of racism, because racism is a gospel issue. I followed a long, enduring civic engagement in social and political activism, the work of solidarity, as well as decades and generations of on-the-ground engagement of other Asian American trailblazers. And I realized that I was not alone. So there was a sense of both unmooring as well as a sense of strength that I've gained as I pondered upon this inflection point of the Atlanta massacre. Now I'm going to pose this next question to Courtney and Jennifer, because we want to know then, in what ways have the most recent events contributed to your Asian American identity and your Christian faith?
Yeah, let me offer just a couple of things. Certainly, this has been an enduring conversation. One thing I might offer here is that my Asian American identity has been made salient to me, that it is pressing and is in need of attention. And I would recount the story more recently that in high school, friends would say, "Courtney, you're so white." And I found that to be such a compliment. And for the first time in college, a sorority sister said to me, "Courtney, you're so white." And I said, "Oh no." And so I'm growing in embracing that Asian American identity. I think what it has identified for me is actually it's made me aware of my own anti-Asian sentiment. I've been very much intimidated by Asian and Asian American spaces. As I mentioned to you, my early career days in politics, and recognizing that I have not been aware of the ways in which I have participated in structures and systems that really have that were not designed for us in mind, but also that I've not made a way for other people who look like me. And so I think those are some big questions, things that I'm continuing to work through. And but really saying like, oh, wait a second. And it really has been because of the three of you, if we can be just real frank here, is that one of our first Zoom calls, and I had friends who prayed over my call, and I said, okay, well, depending on how this conversation goes with these three women will really direct whether or not how far I step in and where I step in. And to say that I can be a voice here, that I do belong here, and that we don't all have to. And Kirsten, you mentioned this, that monolith. I think I perceived it to be quite monolithic, and strangely felt that I was different. I mentioned in elementary school, kids would go to Chinese school on Saturdays, and I was like, I don't do that. Maybe I'm the one who's on the outs. Maybe I don't have a typical Asian American experience, and yet it really has been in Jennifer, you talking about your mixed race upbringing and the complexities there, that I identify with that. The complexities there, and to say, oh, wait a minute, maybe my experience actually isn't so unique, and is tracked back, Kirsten, to the idea that I think my grandparents needed to prove that we were safe, needed to prove that we were acceptable. And this is one of the ways that we did it, was by being high achieving and law abiding and leaders, yes, capable, all of those things. But I think I'm starting to unpack a little bit of that and to embrace, to be willing to say, hey, Luke and Theo, my sweet 7 and 5-year-olds, like, do you know that you are Chinese American? Do you know that matters in some really meaningful ways? Yeah, funny conversation over the dinner table a couple of years ago. I said to Luke, we were talking about the fact that he's Armenian. And he said, yeah, do you know where you get that? And he goes, yeah, I get that from dad. And my husband said, what do you get from mom? And he waited, and he thought, and he said, hugs. And I was like, yes. And also, maybe I need to do a little bit more in helping them understand their Asian American, their Chinese American ethnicity and heritage. With regard to the Christian faith, I think that I am growing in my understanding of wanting to be seen and heard in a lot of those spaces. And my husband will tell you that that's an enduring issue personally, but also I have been deeply honored by the ways in which my community has really said, hey, Courtney, how can we care for you? Hey, what are the questions I should be asking? And I think questions are remarkably powerful. One of the things that I love to say is that questions, what you ask and how you ask communicates what you know and how much you care. And so to invite some questions, to start some of those conversations, I've been deeply honored by those who have engaged that dialogue with me, and to look to Ephesians 2 to say that we are in the work of breaking down the dividing wall of hostility that Jesus has indeed done, that he has brought two men to become one, and how that's traced back to Genesis 33 and Esau and Jacob, who should not be at odds, like embrace one another. That reconciliation, when there has been deep hurt and fear and grief and anger, and that can happen when we wrestle with God and when we engage really deeply with what the Word of God says. There's a lot of stuff that's really troubling. And also, do we look to the hope of the gospel for how it is that we are going to connect with one another when sometimes I don't feel seen, or when sometimes somebody says something with good intentions but comes out poorly? How do we engage? And I think that I've been really impressed upon to step into that ministry of reconciliation as I'm reconciling my own Asian American identity. Oh man, it feels like I'm so disqualified from doing this. But just how do we reconcile with the Lord? How does the Lord reconcile us to himself? And how do we then reconcile among one another? Oftentimes it requires great humility on my part to know that I've been a part of the problem in communicating and living out even some degrees of anti-Asian sentiment myself. Okay, that was a lot. Jennifer, your turn. How have you been processing your Asian American identity, and how does that relate to your Christian faith?
Yeah, thank you, Courtney. I relate so much to what you said of struggling through imposter syndrome, of feeling Asian enough to be in this space being mixed. And like, one of my personal journeys that I've been on is like, I'm not percentages, because in my mind, percentage, like if I say I'm 50% Asian, I have failed. That's a D, like that's a D in school. And so I've really taken on, what does it look like to live in the fullness of my own ethnic journey, to be fully German, Irish, British, and to be fully Filipino and Chinese, and to show up in those spaces. And so these events remind me of two things. The first being, I am made in the image of God. I bear God's Imago Dei, and my Imago Dei is as a mixed Asian American woman. First and foremost, like I am a mixed Asian American woman, and the significance of that in those spaces, and that I am enough when I show up in these spaces, although feeling wildly intimidated in that space. But I love these opportunities to speak and to bring voice to it, because I think had Courtney not said something, had I not said something, we wouldn't have found this deep connection, and then bonded over food later. But we wouldn't have found this connection of that struggle in our own Asian American identity. The second thing that these recent events really bring up in regards to my faith and in regards to my identity is that white supremacy has no place here in our institutions, in our neighborhoods, in our world. White supremacy tells you that I'm not Asian, that I'm just another person, and to love me as a person, and that there's a color blindness in that. White supremacy, I've learned, is not a bad word. It's a word I've had to work really hard to not like flinch as if I'm dropping an S-bomb, to learn to say it out loud. But it's a system that white supremacy pits Koreans and Blacks. It's a system that allows tensions from the LA riots. It's a system that incarcerates people of color at a much higher rate than it does for white people committing the same crimes. It's a system that makes us watch a 9-minute video of watching someone die in order to believe that the death happened. It's a system that we need to abolish. But I think it's together that we can be bonded together against the system of white supremacy. It's not me versus you, it's not us versus them, but it's truly us versus white supremacy. And I think as believers, these events call me to do better. They are calling me to have hard conversations on race and reconciliation. But I don't think reconciliation is reached without truth, without repentance, and without forgiveness. And we have to go through each of those processes. And sometimes it's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult to sit and listen to the really, really hard things that we don't want to hear. But I think it also calls me to show up not just with my words, but with my actions. 1 John 3:18, we are to show up in love, and our love is spoken through our actions. It's a verse that's tattooed on my wrist. And so part of showing up with our actions is not just sending a like on an Instagram post for an Asian friend or a friend of color, but it's truly living and doing life with them. It's not asking the loaded question in this season of how are you, but not really sitting long enough to hear the response. It's truly to engage in relationship. And sometimes it's not even asking the question of how are you, because it's too loaded of a question depending where you catch us in that moment. So like to ask Courtney, how are you after this incident on the freeway? Probably not the best question, although well-meaned. I think sometimes it's as simple as saying, I see you and I stand with you. And a lot of times that gives a gateway of feeling seen, and I can show up and share as much as I want to share or as much as I feel comfortable sharing, but knowing that there is that support there. And then I think there's a relational equity that's involved too in how we do life together. So sometimes it is buying meals and coffee or giving flowers, answering my phone call when I call, if you know that I'm processing through a lot. It's even in the midst of the verdict last week, for me, it was canceling a dinner where I didn't feel like I could fully show up in that space, but then also being like, hey, you are a mom of Black sons and I see you and I support you. Can I buy you dinner? Can I buy your family dinner tonight? Because I know today is just a hard day. And so it's looking at how can we see each other and show up in those spaces in that regard. I'd love to invite Regina and Kirsten into the conversation before we transition to the next questions of how has this, how has your identity and your Christian faith kind of shown up in these spaces?
Yeah, I can start us off. Although I love hearing from Kirsten because she's a practical theologian. She's really helped me understand the practical side of theology. So that's been awesome. But I'll start us out and then Kirsten, please answer. So, really, I always feel like God prepares me for the next season. So before the pandemic, I was reading in Job. I don't know why I was reading in Job. God put on my heart to read in Job. I usually avoid reading Job. So now we know why I had to read that. But before Atlanta, I was reading in Acts and Romans. And so I just wanted to share a couple of verses that just popped like they never have done before. I read these 100 times and they just feel new and fresh to me in light of what's been going on. So in Acts 22:25-29, Paul claims his Roman citizenship even as he is in chains. He does this a couple times, right? And Kirsten, please correct me if I get the theology wrong, but Paul says to the centurion, is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty? And then the commander is there as well. And he's so intrigued by Paul. And he tells him he had to pay a big price to be a Roman citizen. So you guys, I've been thinking about that verse so much. It just continues to be in my mind and I just claim it. I was born here in LA. I claim my Americanness. I claim my family's belonging here in a way that I've never had to before. And just another verse that's popped out is Acts 17:26. And it says, from one man he made every nation of men or women that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. So God has placed me, has placed all of us, Courtney, Jennifer, Kirsten, all of us together here at APU to live here. I know we belong here. The sad thing is, when I first learned about persecution in the church, I never ever thought about it being because of my race or ethnicity. I always thought it would be about my faith as a Christian, not because I'm Chinese. So, what I long for in unity and solidarity, I know will come in my citizenship in heaven as a daughter of Christ. God is also Chinese. I know that because in Genesis, he says, like Jennifer told us earlier, that we're all made in the image of God. He enjoys my Chinese American way of seeing and interacting, communicating. I can go on tangents. That's just part of who I am. He loves the way I see the world in that way. I am known and I am seen at the very least by God. And sometimes it may be a lonelier road for all of us at times. Ever since the murder of George Floyd, I've also been reading a lot from Christian thinkers and scholars on race. Jamara Tisby, our own Dr. Alexander Jun, Dr. Sung Chong Ra. These men have paved this road for me to embrace my faith through this process of racial awakening that I think I'm still in process about, just like Courtney has mentioned. Yet here with my East Asian American sisters, we walk this road only the way we can in our unique stories of being female and Christian and Asian Americans. It is that intersectionality that I hope you hear today. That's expressions of culture that have origins in the countries of our ancestors and the country where we live here and work and raise our families here today and here with you at APU. So as Christians, I see the fruits of the Spirit of Galatians, of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. They are all exemplified in my family's cultural values. Their kindness, their humility, their hospitality. I'm learning about how Christian solidarity is not just about the spiritual realm, but also about active embodied unity. Just as Jennifer said, giving meals to people, just coming in solidarity, because Christ came to earth as a person born through an actual woman named Mary. The incarnation is so that we may embrace and be embraced in the bodily package we come in the families and Asian cultures we were raised in. And there's something I love about my Chinese heritage, which is a fully embodied presence. My family, they will show up whenever I signal that I need them. I don't even have to ask. They will just intuit it. And my grandmother will cook not just one dish, but she'll make 5 to 7 dishes of food and spend days curing the meat, soaking the herbs, picking out the ingredients at the market. I appreciate all these incarnational embraces from my family. I would honestly, you all really miss those kind of expressions of love and care if it weren't for the incarnation. People touched Jesus's cloak. Jesus turned water into wine. These are tangible expressions of faith. These are kind of easy things to grasp in a theology of incarnational Christ, because I was birthed from my mother's womb in Los Angeles as an American Chinese woman.
Yeah, so as I look at the panel, I am just recognizing that I may be the only one that actually immigrated. So I'm an immigrant. When I first immigrated to the US, what I was given was this little card that I carried around for the first few days of my life here in the US. And it was a resident alien card, that I was a legal alien in this country. There's something interesting about that. I won't go into all the details and feelings of what that meant to carry that card. But one of the things that I want to recognize is that, you know what, as Christians, we're all called to be resident aliens in this earth anyway, right? I have this habit, like towards the end of each year, I ask God, what do you, in review of this year, what do you have for me in the upcoming year? And something really interesting happened at the end of 2018. I had this dream where I was like really struggling to fit in. This is a struggle that I've had all of my life, living in this Asian American body in the United States. I've had this feeling of liminality, this place of in between where I'm like, where do I fit? God, how do I live into the reality of whom you've called me to be in a place that constantly sees me as an outsider rather than an insider? And I remember in this dream, just really like, I don't know if you've ever had this anxiety of wanting to belong, wanting somebody to say, you don't have to do anything, you don't have to say anything, but you are with us. I am with you. And so I know that I have that feeling in my family, but never felt it outside of my family really, except with very close friends. And in this dream, I heard a voice that said, you belong to me. Oh my gosh, sisters, I just woke up with that dream going, I belong to God. That for me was so powerful that the whole year of 2019, I repeated that to myself again and again. Every time I felt this sense of outsider syndrome, like outsiders, I belong to God, right? I belong to God. I prayed again in 2019, how do I prepare for 2020? And I expected something very different, like, oh, some other thing. Same thing came. 2020, you need this message. You belong to me. Who knew that God was preparing me for 2020 pandemic at the end of 2018? This is what theologians call prevenient grace, grace that went before me. I had no idea I needed this grace. Yet God showered me with that grace. And I believe that God showers that grace to people who needed to hear the voice of God calling in the wilderness to say, you belong to me because I have created you beautifully and wonderfully. Where you feel no belonging, where you feel the liminality, that's how I want you to live as a Christian in this country. Whether you belong to this world, God says we do not really belong to this world. You belong to me. And we resident alien this world together. I'll stop there.
Jennifer, would you want to say anything about that liminality feeling? I feel like that resonates with me, and I had a curiosity about how that phrase that might speak to what we've talked about before. Anything you'd want to share there?
Yeah. Luminality, I think is one of my favorite words this year as I'm in process and in transition, because I feel like it gives me space. It's the here and the not yet. And being in that space, I am a PAC fellow this year, which stands for Progressive Asian American Christians. And it has just offered me a space of thinking and processing of what it looks like to decolonize and deconstruct my faith, and to be okay with laying it all out and figuring out what I believe and where I stand. And then the most important part, I think, I'm having issues with that word today. But the most important part, I think, is the reconstruction of your faith after you've laid everything out. I think we see so many people and believers deconstruct and be upset and angry at the church, but we never reconstruct and pick our faith back up, pick our box back up. I've had to move multiple times this last year in COVID, which is not anything I wish on anyone to move in a pandemic. But what does it look like to repack once you've decided where you stand and what you believe? And so I am thankful for places and people who create liminal space for me to be in the here and the not yet. Because I think God calls us into so many of those spaces of the here and the not yet, and what it looks like to explore and to unpack and to learn. And like, that's the process I find myself in, is like, I'm constantly trying to soak in content and learning and understanding. And I think that learning is out there for all of us to embrace in, whether it's learning about the Asian American diaspora and what it means to be Asian American, learning about xenophobia and the impact of race and racism. I think for myself, like, I was taught in school, racism started with Pearl Harbor. And when you actually do the reading and you actually understand the history of our country, it started a long time before that, even before the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so it's been this very eye-opening, wide experience that I'm giving myself space and grace to be in, while still holding on to my faith, but still unpacking some things that I've learned that maybe were incorrect, or that were through a white lens only. And so I'm thankful I'm a part of a church and a community and a center that allows us to do that, allows me to do that, and sits with me in the midst of being in the middle, and it's okay. So I love what Kirsten said of like, God meets us in that middle ground. God allows us to be in that space. And I just think God also was in a liminal space. He was fully God and fully human and spirit. And so God shifted in between that liminal space as well. And we are allowed to be in that space too.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful even for those who are, the attendees here on the call, but I hope you hear the humility here, is to say a lot of us are still in process. And while there are things to say, to welcome you to the table also. I think sometimes there's an expectation for some of us to say certain things when particular things happen, and also to invite the complexity of your own identities into this space, to go, yeah, just because you are. And Jennifer, as you said earlier, this fight against white supremacy is not a fight against white people. And so we've got to be really clear about some of that, and the ways in which we welcome everyone to this table of reconciliation, to say, I want to have a conversation. I want you to know me. I want to be known and seen and heard. And also, I think I have important questions to ask you across the table, to say, how are you entering this conversation in this space as well? And so that complexity, I think, continues to resonate with me and challenge me in some difficult ways. Kirsten and Regina, do you feel like you have had an opportunity to talk about this relationship between your Asian American identity and your Christian identity? I know we had talked a little bit about y'all doing that. Do you feel like you've had an opportunity to engage that question?
Yeah, thank you for posing that deeply connectional question, because they have to be connected, right? Because we're both Asian American women and we are Christian. To answer that question, let me start with the story and end with a song. About a month ago, I was carting some kimchi and bulgogi through the aisles at H Mart, a Korean supermarket in Arcadia. Love that market. I started to do something that caught even me by surprise. It was a surprise because the context of this act comes amid the exponential rise in anti-Asian hate. And as at the heart of the ways in which our ethnic and faith communities have been traumatized again and again, at H Mart, I subconsciously commenced an act of resistance against the trauma-inflicting and triggering virulent animosity that we were facing. I started the random prayers of blessings for God's presence and protection. Out of nowhere, I just started randomly blessing in my heart the people around me, these precious people who are out walking and shopping while Asian, the elderly, the women, the children who are in the aisles, who are at the checking lines. I just started to randomly bless them. I believe this was the movement of the Holy Spirit, a prevenient grace, as I mentioned before, where God's Spirit hovered over the pain of collective and generational trauma and asked me to participate in the healing work of the Spirit of Christ. As part of my Christian identity, one who is holy and beloved, according to Colossians 3, these random prayers of blessings were ways in which I was wearing God that day, and that I'm trying to cultivate this very difficult habit of throwing on the cloak of God every single time I'm out in public. The God of compassion, the God of humility, the God of patience, the one that yearns for justice, equity, and righteousness in the midst of God's image bearers. These random prayers of blessing became for me an act of resistance and coping skills for resiliency. They help stave off the fear and the anger that had been slowly and cumulatively storing in me through the continual racialization of Asian Americans. Someone said that race is a verb because it's a process, a dynamic process in which people are racialized in the US. Asian Americans have endured historic injuries and injustices in the US, like the Chinese massacre of 1871 in the streets of Los Angeles, where 17 Chinese men and boys were lynched by an angry mob of nearly 500 people. That's where Los Angeles Union Station is. It was the biggest one-time lynching in the US history. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the yellow peril myth of the 20th century also displayed the various racialized xenophobic rhetoric and policies. When I hear Black Friday, I don't think about shop till you drop Friday after Thanksgiving. Black Friday was the expulsion of Chinese Americans from the city of Pasadena, 2 cities from where I live in Monrovia. That Pasadena, the home of the Rose Bowl and the Rose Parade 135 years ago in 1885, burned down Chinese-owned businesses, swore to not rent or sell to Chinamen, and threatened any rebellious Chinese of lynching. The internment of 120 Japanese Americans during World War II, the racial strife of LA riots against 2,280 Korean American-owned stores that were looted, burned, and damaged in 1992. And then we see what's happening in 2020, 2021. As I mentioned before, my identity as an Asian American Christian female has become somewhat unmoored. I negotiate these multiple identities, but I'm most interested in what Jesus's answer is to this existential question of who am I? My groaning prayer these days, once again, is, Lord, who do you say that I am? Jesus says to his disciples in Matthew, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Jennifer mentioned how we have to shine our light. The impact of these parallel identity statements that differentiate the followers of Jesus and those who are not followers of Jesus is huge for me. I have to say, it is an honor to be an Asian of this embodiment, this face, this body, this legacy, this heritage, this culture, in all of its glorious beauty and brokenness. In my embodiment, I am called to be God's light and salt, which leads to my song. When I was 3 or 4 back in South Korea, I learned a song that I loved singing because it had hand motions and etc. And it comes from Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus is preaching his first recorded sermon. 이 작은 나의 빛 비추게 할 거야. 이 작은 나의 빛 비추게 할 거야. You know that song. I don't have to translate that for you. I had since then learned that this song, it was an anthem, one of the anthems in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, along with other songs such as Go Tell It on the Mountain and We Shall Overcome. As one of the freedom songs, this little light of mine reminded the justice-seeking civil rights movement to declare thy identity in Christ, rise up from the systems of oppression, and stand up for what is just. this morning, I invite everyone participating in this panel to sing that song. We need to sing it to remind ourselves that who we are and whose we are interconnected, so that we can live in this world through that identity and belonging. Regina, I want to ask you this question too. In what ways does being an Asian American in the United States help us learn more about who we are as Christians? In what ways does being a Christian Asian?
I think I got it. The audio kicked out a little bit. I'll just say, because you said that so eloquently, Kirsten, I don't have much to add except to say that I think one thing that I'm learning in relation to kind of this imposter syndrome is to understand that, in terms of our theology and faith, that there's something that we bring to the table as Asian Americans, this idea of hospitality, this kind of things that I've alluded to earlier, this sort of circular thinking and holistic thinking. I think a lot about, body, mind, and spirit as I think about my faith and how I can engage all three aspects. That's something a lot of I do a lot of Christian mindfulness, but that's really a direct lineage from my Buddhist grandparents and how I've integrated in terms of my thinking and worship of God is Jesus into that space. And so I think there is something that is lost when our churches, even our multi-ethnic churches, don't allow that kind of thinking to happen, that we're all limited by a singular story of who Christ is, of kind of what Jennifer talked about, this white supremacist theology that isn't rooted in revelations, all tribe, every nation, every tongue will worship together, that we really need to give each other space, whether it's in our discipline or at chapel or just practically at APU, that there's something we as Asian Americans or Asian immigrants bring to this table of rich history, ancient philosophy, that as Christians, we are equipped to be able to integrate really spectacularly. Let me give the floor to Courtney to help us transition. Courtney, you're muted.
Kirsten has some resources. Kirsten, can you give like a 2-sentence talk on some of the resources, and then we'd love to invite Richard Martinez to the conversation as well.
Yes, thank you. As you have heard from this panel, racism against Asian American Pacific Islanders is longstanding and complex and requires a comprehensive and multifaceted approach. But as I said before, racism is a gospel issue. We have compiled a Google Doc to help answer this question about what can you do? What are some action items that we can take? And it will be sent to all of the participants via email shortly. The document addresses some of the helpful questions we received regarding supporting our AAPI faculty and colleagues and students. And if I can highlight one or two, I just want to say that APU is going to be sponsoring a Lilly conference that's going to be here in May, on May 26th and 27th. I ask you to attend it as much as you can. The conference themes are around healthcare, economics, anti-racism, and sociopolitics. I curated the anti-racism invited panel, and it's amazing women of color. I have an African-American sister, a South Asian sister, and a Latina sister who engage in very robust conversations about racism and anti-racism from a personal and professional space. So please go ahead and attend that. There's also a Building Solidarity between Black and Asian American communities coming up on May 5th. Again, there are a whole bunch of other items that you can do, but consider also 2 trainings to become an actual ally. And that is the bystander training as well as harassment intervention training. Again, all of these things are found in your Google Docs. There's also items in terms of faculty, what you can do to help students in terms of the microaggression versus micro-resistance, and how you can implement some of the ways in which faculty have the authority and the power in somewhat to support students of color. So those are all included in that document that will be sent shortly to you. I'm grateful to be among my colleagues this morning to share from our hearts. And I now ask Richard Martinez for your closing remarks and prayer. Unmute, Richard.
Thank you so much. Thank you for everyone who attended today. And you have some references in the chat, please. We're all educators that are joining us today, so you have homework. I'm going to give you all homework to look at the resources, to click on, to join the future conversations, and listen to this again. I think there's so much richness that could have been missed in just listening that we'll have this video available. It's been videotaped. Listen to it again. Please listen to it again. And I know we're running out of time, but could we give a virtual applause, first of all, to all of our fantastic, inspired women of color, Asian women of color, who have shared from the depths of their experiences with us today. So please, thank you so much. Thank you so much on behalf of the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, our ethnic organizations out of the SCRD, our affinity mosaic groups. And I'm saying this, I know I'm rushing, but join, be a part of our community. We're a big part of APU, but there are other conversations that can be taking place in our affinity groups, in our ethnic organizations. Join us in these types of panels. And I have just a couple, oh, wow, I think I'm out of time, but I do want to highlight a couple things. Please bear with me, is that thanks to each panelist, because Kirsten modeled some things, that action items to do. She mentioned to fight racism, to counter anti-Asian hate, random prayers of blessing. I know that's hard to do, but when you're in this hateful world, try to press the pause button in your own head and start random prayers of blessing for others, those around you. And I need to remember that. The other thing too is that was mentioned, you belong to me. The Lord is wrapping us with his love and his care, even as our panelists were speaking. That was part of healing. Brothers and sisters, that's part of healing. We need that. And we need to bless each other, random prayers of blessing, but we also need to remember to whom we get those blessings from, and sing in our hearts, and sing to others. And we need to fight hate, and we can't do it alone. The voice of God in the wilderness is calling to us, and we need to listen. I'm going to go back to what Courtney started with, and this is the hard part, is asking questions that I've never asked before. Sometimes we don't ask the questions because, frankly, we're afraid of the answers. I think we know what's going to happen, or we know how somebody's going to react, or we know the hate that might be redirected back to us. But brothers and sisters, we need to ask the questions. And we can't do it alone. So let's be in community. Let's be surrounded by the love of the Lord, and he will guide us. Fear keeps us away from the Lord. I'll say that again. Fear keeps us away from the Lord, and that's what the devil wants. is separation from the power and the glory of our Holy Spirit and our great Jesus Christ. So we need to be able to embrace that power and that glory. And hallelujah, once again, for all of our wonderful panelists today, thank you for inspiring us. And thank you for living and for speaking truth into this world that needs all of you so desperately. Hallelujah, and God bless everyone. And thank you all for joining us today.